Have you ever felt like your faith was fading, as if God were distant, as if your prayers didn't go beyond the ceiling? This feeling is more common than you might think, and many face such moments without knowing what to do. The good news is that there is a way to overcome this darkness, and it was revealed centuries ago by a man who deeply understood the challenges of the soul, Saint John of the Cross. He not only lived through periods of profound spiritual pain, but also understood what these moments mean and how to transform them into a bridge to a stronger, more mature, and deeper faith. His teachings are not just theory. They were written with tears, prayers, and an unyielding quest for God, even in moments when everything seemed lost. In this video, we will delve into the secrets of Saint John of the Cross for overcoming spiritual trials. We will understand how his experiences can help us face crises of faith, find peace amid pain, and above all, realize that God never abandons us, even when we don't feel his presence. Historical and cultural context. In the 16th century, Europe was undergoing a period of intense religious and political transformations. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, questioning practices such as the sale of indulgences. This movement caused a fragmentation in Western Christianity, leading to the emergence of various Protestant denominations. In response, the Catholic Church launched the Counter-Reformation, an effort to reaffirm its dogmas and curb the advance of Protestantism. Significant measures were adopted, such as the creation of the Society of Jesus in 1534, aimed at education and evangelization, and the reactivation of the Inquisition Tribunal to combat heresies. The Council of Trent, 1545-1563, was convened to define guidelines and reform internal church practices. In this scenario of spiritual renewal, the Carmelite order, with roots tracing back to the hermits of Mount Carmel in the Holy Land, sought to return to its origins of contemplation and austerity. Saint Teresa of Avila in 1560 initiated a reform within the order, establishing monasteries that emphasized prayer and simple communal life. This reform aimed to restore the purity of the Carmelite charism, adapting it to the spiritual needs of the time. The Teresian reform resonated with other members of the order who saw the need for a more authentic and committed religious life. It was in this context that Saint John of the Cross emerged as a central figure, collaborating with Saint Teresa in founding the Discalced Carmelites, a branch that sought a stricter observance of the Carmelite rule. The collaboration between Teresa and John of the Cross would be fundamental to the development of this reform, which would face challenges both internal and external. The life of Saint John of the Cross, the spiritual journey, childhood and formation. Saint John of the Cross was born on June 24, 1542, in the small village of Fontiveros, in the region of Avila, Spain. His childhood was marked by poverty and hardships. His father, Gonzalo de Yepes, came from a noble family but was disinherited for marrying Catalina Alvarez, a weaver of humble origin. After his father's death, John, still a child, experienced the harsh reality of scarcity and had to work to help his mother and siblings. Despite this, his intelligence and dedication to studies caught the attention of benefactors who helped him enter the Jesuit College of Medina del Campo. There, he came into contact with classical literature, theology, and spiritual writings that would shape his mystical vision. Monastic life. Around the age of 21, John joined the Carmelite order, adopting monastic life with great zeal. He was sent to study at the prestigious University of Salamanca, one of the most important intellectual centers of the time. There, he deepened his knowledge in theology and philosophy, preparing for a life of service to God. But John was not seeking just academic knowledge. He thirsted for something greater, a profound and transformative experience with the divine. His restless spirit yearned for a radical living of faith, a path that would not settle for the minimum, but would lead him to total surrender to God. Meeting with Saint Teresa of Avila. In 1567, his life took a decisive turn when he met Saint Teresa of Avila. The Carmelite mystic, already involved in the reform of the Carmelite order, recognized in John a kindred spirit. Teresa sought to restore the purity of contemplative life, and John desired a more austere and profound monastic experience. Thus convinced by Teresa, he joined the reform, and in 1568 founded the first monastery of the Discalced Carmelites in Duruelo, a place of extreme simplicity and rigor. From that moment on, his life became an even more intense quest for union with God, treading a path that few would dare to follow. The mystical experience and the dark night of the soul. The mystical experience. From an early age, John of the Cross showed a profound spiritual sensitivity. His quest for God was not just theoretical, but experiential. He wanted to know God not just through books, but within his own soul. Throughout his life, he experienced moments of intense divine union, described as spiritual ecstasies, visions, and revelations. But these encounters did not come without challenges. For the soul to reach this closeness with God, it needed to be purified. And it was precisely this purification that John described in his doctrine of the dark night of the soul. What is the dark night? The dark night of the soul is not a punishment, but a process of transformation. It is when the soul feels that God is distant, that prayers seem empty, and that nothing makes sense anymore. Many saints have gone through this, and even ordinary believers can experience this phase. Imagine a barren desert where everything seems dry and lifeless. This is the feeling of those who go through the dark night. But John taught that despite the pain, this moment was essential. God was purifying the soul, preparing it for a deeper communion with him. The two nights. John of the Cross differentiated two phases of this experience: the active night and the passive night. The active night is when the person themselves strives to detach from worldly pleasures and desires that distance them from God. It is a conscious process of renunciation and discipline. The passive night, on the other hand, is when God himself takes the initiative and leads the soul through a path of trial. Here, the person no longer has control. It is God who acts, withdrawing all sensible consolation and leaving the soul in darkness. But this darkness is not an end, but a means to something much greater: theological significance. What John taught is that the dark night was not an obstacle, but a gift. It was a path to true union with God. In theological terms, it was the process of purifying the soul, necessary for it to receive the fullness of grace. Just as gold needs to pass through fire to be purified, the soul also needs to traverse this desert to be shaped by God. This teaching continues to be a source of consolation for many people who face periods of spiritual darkness, reminding them that even when God seems distant, he is working silently within them. Literary and mystical works. St. John of the Cross not only deeply lived his mystical experience, but also left writings that guide generations on the spiritual journey. His works are true maps for those seeking union with God. Among them are The Ascent of Mount Carmel, The Dark Night of the Soul, Spiritual Canticle, and Living Flame of Love. These writings are not simple theological treatises. They are poems and reflections that speak directly to the heart. He used metaphors and symbols to express profound spiritual realities, making his texts accessible and at the same time inexhaustible in meaning. The Ascent of Mount Carmel is a fundamental work for understanding the soul's path to God. John of the Cross uses the image of a mountain to represent this journey. The path is arduous, requiring renunciation and detachment, but it leads to a state of fullness. He describes the challenges the faithful face and how they must abandon them to achieve true communion with God. This idea of spiritual ascent resonates to this day, as many face difficulties in their faith journey, feeling lost or unmotivated. In the dark night of the soul, he delves into the experience of spiritual purification. So the text not only explains the soul's suffering, but also shows how it is necessary for a more authentic encounter with God. It is a work that speaks about pain, but also about hope. John does not describe the darkness as a punishment, but as a process of maturation, in which God empties the soul of everything that is not essential to fill it with his love. Those who have gone through moments of spiritual desolation can find comfort in the saint's words, realizing that the absence of God is, in fact, a silent presence. Spiritual Canticle is perhaps his most beautiful work. Inspired by the Song of Songs from the Bible, it is a poem that describes the soul's relationship with God as a romance between the beloved and the lover. Here, John of the Cross shows us that the relationship with God is not just a path of renunciation, but also of deep and intimate love. The text overflows with spiritual desire, divine passion, and joy for union with God. Many saints and mystics have found in this work a language to express their own experiences with the divine. Finally, Living Flame of Love describes the final stage of the soul's union with God, when there are no more barriers between creator and creature. John speaks of a love that burns but does not destroy. It purifies and elevates. It is the pinnacle of the spiritual journey, where the soul, once lost in darkness, finds itself completely filled with divine light. This work teaches that the Christian life is not limited to rules or sacrifices, but to a deep relationship with God, where love is the key to everything. These works remain alive and relevant because they speak of the universal experience of seeking God. And who has never felt this longing within themselves, this thirst for something greater, this desire to find oneself in something that transcends the material world? St. John of the Cross not only understood this need, but left us the answers to it. Union with God, the goal of the spiritual journey. The entire trajectory of St. John of the Cross converges to a single purpose, the union of the soul with God. This union is not a distant metaphor, but a real, profound, and transformative experience. He describes this state as a burning love, where the soul and God become one, without barriers, without distractions. But reaching this point requires detachment, purification, and total surrender. It is a process that is not always easy, but leads to unparalleled peace. He uses strong images to express this experience. He speaks of a living flame of love that consumes but does not destroy, that warms but does not hurt. This flame represents God's presence in the soul, illuminating everything and filling every space. Unlike human love, which can be unstable, this divine love is pure, absolute, and eternal. Those who achieve this union feel an indescribable joy, a happiness that does not depend on external circumstances, but is born from the very encounter with God. The fruits of this union are evident. The person who completely surrenders to God experiences a peace that nothing can shake. The worries of the world lose their strength, fears dissipate, and the heart is filled with unconditional love. John of the Cross teaches that in this state, the soul no longer seeks anything other than God. Everything that once seemed essential, status, possessions, recognition, becomes irrelevant. What remains is pure, unreserved love. But how to achieve this union? John of the Cross explains that there are no shortcuts. It is a path of renunciation, patience, and trust. He invites us to abandon everything that prevents us from surrendering to God, whether it be attachment to sin or fear of total surrender. This process can be compared to cleaning a mirror covered in dust. At first it seems difficult, but little by little the surface becomes clear until it finally reflects the divine light. This journey, though challenging, is not impossible. Many have already traveled it and found in God the answer to their deepest longings. And in the end, when the soul reaches this union, there are no more doubts, only certainty. Certainty that it was worth it. Certainty that God was present in every step, even in moments of darkness. And it is precisely here that the great challenge begins. Persecution and imprisonment. The quest for the reform of the Carmelite order brought great challenges for St. John of the Cross. Not everyone looked favorably upon the changes he and St. Teresa of Avila were implementing. The desire to return to the original purity of the Carmelite rule, with more austerity and prayer, met strong opposition within the order itself. Many Carmelites, attached to a milder lifestyle, saw John of the Cross as a threat. The result was growing persecution, culminating in his imprisonment in the Carmelite convent of Toledo in December 1577, when he was about 35 years old. The imprisonment was brutal. Locked in a tiny cell, without light and almost without ventilation, John suffered hunger, cold, and frequent beatings. The Carmelite superiors who opposed the reform wanted to break him, to make him give up his mission. But it was during this period of suffering that he experienced some of the most profound mystical experiences of his life. There, amid pain, he found God in an even more intense way. It was in this darkness that part of his masterpiece was born, the dark night of the soul. Without paper or ink, he composed verses in his mind and memorized them, feeding his soul with poetry and prayer. Each word reflected the inner struggle of a man who, even in abandonment and solitude, did not cease to trust in divine love. He understood that true freedom is not in the absence of physical chains, but in total surrender to God. After 9 months of suffering, John of the Cross managed to escape in an almost miraculous way. With the help of some allies, he fled by climbing the convent walls and found refuge among the discalced Carmelites. His escape was not only a physical liberation, but also a symbol of his resilience. He emerged from imprisonment transformed, more convinced than ever of his spiritual mission. But the impact of this experience did not end with his escape. The pain he faced in Toledo further shaped his spirituality. He realized that the darkness of imprisonment was only an external reflection of the darkness many face within themselves. And it is precisely this journey through the darkness of the soul that will lead to the understanding of the profound legacy he left. Spiritual legacy and influence. After his escape from imprisonment in 1578, St. John of the Cross dedicated the following years to deepening his spirituality and strengthening the Carmelite reform. His testimony of unwavering faith, even in the face of persecution, solidified his reputation as a true master of the interior life. He not only continued to spiritually guide his discalced Carmelite brothers, but also wrote some of his most sublime mystical works. His writings were not just theological reflections, but a detailed map of the soul in its quest for union with God. The impact of his teachings transcended the convent walls and influenced generations of Christians seeking a deeper path of prayer and contemplation. His doctrine on the dark night of the soul became a reference for those facing spiritual crises and periods of dryness in faith. He taught that darkness, often feared and misunderstood, was actually a process of purification led by God. His message resonated especially among mystics, theologians, and spiritual seekers who saw in his words a beacon on the journey to holiness. Centuries after his death, his influence has not diminished. In 1726, he was canonized by Pope Benedict XIII, and in 1926, he was proclaimed a Doctor of the Church by Pope Pius II, a recognition of his immense contribution to mystical theology. His doctrine on spiritual asceticism, the need for detachment, and absolute love for God continues to be studied to this day. Many saints and theologians have been deeply influenced by him, including Saint Therese of the Child Jesus and Pope John Paul II himself, who wrote his doctoral thesis on the writings of John of the Cross. But the legacy of St. John of the Cross is not just in his titles or theological treatises. He remains alive in those who today seek a more authentic and profound faith. His work is an invitation for those who wish to transform suffering into an opportunity for spiritual growth. And more than ever, his teachings are essential for a world facing crises of faith and meaning. But how can we apply his lessons in everyday life? How can his teachings help us face challenges, pains, and uncertainties? Applying the teachings of St. John of the Cross in modern life. The spiritual life, like any journey, is full of challenges. Moments of darkness, loneliness, and doubts are part of the path. St. John of the Cross understood this like few others. He taught that the dark night was not a punishment, but a necessary process for the soul to detach from illusions and truly draw closer to God. Today, this lesson is more relevant than ever. Many people face spiritual crises without understanding that these periods of dryness can actually be invitations to deepen their faith. But how to overcome these moments? St. John of the Cross emphasized the need for perseverance. When faith seems to cool, prayer becomes difficult, and God seems distant, the solution is not to give up but to move forward, even without feeling anything. This applies to practical life as well. How many times do we abandon something simply because we no longer feel enthusiasm? He teaches that true love, whether for God or a purpose, does not depend on fleeting feelings, but on a firm decision to continue. Another valuable teaching is the importance of the interior life. We live in times when noise and distractions take over the mind and heart. John of the Cross showed that without moments of silence and recollection, the soul hardly finds peace. This does not mean that everyone should become monks, but cultivating moments of quiet in the routine can transform the way we deal with challenges. Practices such as contemplative prayer, Christian meditation, and spiritual reading can help build this connection with God. Moreover, he teaches us about detachment. Today, it is common to measure happiness by what one possesses, achievements, recognition. But he reminds us that true contentment does not come from anything external. What happens when everything we value crumbles? If our peace depends only on favorable circumstances, we will be swept away by life's storms. St. John of the Cross invites us to find joy that cannot be shaken, that which comes from union with God. These lessons are not just beautiful words, but concrete directions for facing difficult times. And if they worked for him, who lived through persecution, imprisonment, and suffering, they can work for us too. But how can this wisdom be applied to modern spiritual challenges? How do the teachings of a 16th century saint still make sense in today's world? Contemporary relevance. The teachings of St. John of the Cross transcend the centuries and remain more alive than ever. The dark night of the soul, for example, is a concept that resonates deeply with modern spiritual challenges. Today, many people experience crises of faith, periods of anguish, and a sense of emptiness without understanding that this can be a call to something greater. In the fast-paced and noisy world we live in, where everything seems to demand immediate answers, the idea of going through a time of darkness without guarantees can seem daunting. But John of the Cross teaches us that this process is actually a path to transformation. Many feel that in their spiritual journey, They face moments of discouragement, coldness in faith, and even the feeling that God is distant. This can happen even to those who dedicate themselves to religious life. But John of the Cross shows us that these periods are not signs of failure, but opportunities for a more mature love. He explains that when God withdraws the sensible consolations from the soul, He is inviting the person to love Him more purely without relying on fleeting emotions. This understanding can radically change the way we deal with the ups and downs of spiritual life. Another deeply relevant aspect today is the invitation to silence and introspection. In a time of constant distractions, St. John of the Cross reminds us that God reveals Himself in the silence of the heart. This does not mean fleeing the world, but finding moments of recollection amid the routine. Many who seek spiritual growth end up overloading themselves with information, studies, and external practices, forgetting that the essence of the journey lies within the soul. John of the Cross teaches that union with God does not come from excessive activity, but from sincere surrender and detachment from everything that hinders this communion. The search for happiness is also a central theme in his legacy. The modern world promises us satisfaction in so many things: material goods, status, recognition, but in the end, many feel empty. John of the Cross, with his wisdom, warns us that true happiness is not in having more, but in wanting less. He teaches us to find joy in what is eternal, not in what can be lost. This is a profoundly liberating message for those who feel that something is always missing to feel complete. His writings, his life, and his testimony are an invitation to all who seek answers to the crises of the soul. And the question remains: how can we apply this wisdom in our daily journey? How can we let the teachings of John of the Cross illuminate our personal and spiritual challenges? Now that you know the profound teachings of St. John of the Cross, it's time to put this wisdom into practice in your life. Remember that when it seems like your faith is being tested to the maximum, you are not alone. The dark night can be frightening, but it is precisely in it that your soul can be purified and draw closer to God. Do not give up. Continue praying, seek silence, and above all, trust that in every moment of darkness, God is working in you. Ask yourself, how can I apply this patience and perseverance in my own spiritual journey? What can I do to detach from the distractions of the world and focus more on what truly matters? St. John of the Cross teaches us that when we seek God with a pure and humble heart, He reveals Himself in wonderful ways, even amid difficulties. If you felt touched by this teaching, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications to continue learning more about how to apply this wisdom in your spiritual life. May this journey be transformative for you, and may you draw closer to God every day, overcoming any trial with faith and trust.